I nearly choked on my coffee when I turned down Maplewood Drive. Bright neon pool floats bobbed in my backyard, and at least 80 people milled around my once secluded swimming pool. I thought I was hallucinating. My property in Oak Hills, a quiet suburban corner of Northern Virginia, had always been a refuge from noise and drama. But that calm shattered the moment I saw this unexpected pool party unfolding behind my house. Earlier that morning, I'd come back from a brief trip to D.C., where I'd been finalizing some legal work. See, I'm known in certain circles as a feared or ruthless lawyer, someone who's not afraid to take on big corporations or government agencies. Outside of court, though, folks consider me just a single guy with a big house, a sprawling yard, and a pool that's fed by a small natural spring. I never brag about it, but I do quietly own rights to the water source that trickles through Oak Hills. My father left me that deed, ensuring I had complete say over how the spring is used or diverted. I never dreamed those water rights would matter so much, until I found an entire neighborhood partying on my property without my permission. I stepped out of my car, heart pounding. Something about a crowd in my yard made my skin crawl. Some guests wore bright swimwear, others lounged in foldable chairs lined up near the pool's edge. A table loaded with coolers and snack trays, complete with a banner that read, HOA Summer Bash, stretched across the side of my lawn. My immaculate porch displayed a giant sign reading, Welcome Maplewood residents, enjoy the pool, pinned up with neon tape. The gall was unbelievable. Standing near the gate, checking a clipboard, was a woman with short dark hair and an officious air. Miss Angela Rogers, president of the Oak Hills HOA. She wore a tailored blouse, a bright smile, and an expression that said she owned the entire world. She held a phone to her ear, glancing up at intervals to greet new arrivals who scurried in with beach towels and kids trailing behind. As I approached, she ended her call and turned to me with a polite but dismissive nod. It was clear she hadn't expected me home. "Oh, Mr. Kelly," she said, feigning pleasant surprise. "I thought you were out of town. We've arranged a special event for Maplewood residents, sort of a last-minute summer pool day. I didn't think you'd mind. Your pool is rarely in use, right?" She gestured to the throng of people behind her. I stared at her, dumbfounded. My pool is rarely in use because it's mine. Since when does the HOA have the right to invite 80 guests onto my private property? She blinked, tilting her chin up with false confidence. "Well," she said, "we have an extended community plan that includes the water source behind your home. The board determined it was in the neighborhood's best interest to have shared access to the pool for certain events. It's spelled out in the new guidelines we sent last month." I took a slow breath to steady myself. "You mean the revised guidelines that I explicitly refused to sign because they tried to absorb my land into the HOA's domain?" She shrugged, forcing a smile. "You can always dispute it at the next board meeting, but for now, these families are enjoying a day by the pool. It's for the good of the community. Let's not cause a scene." I stared past her at a pair of kids jumping into the deep end, squealing with delight. Others formed a line at a cooler, grabbing sodas. A portable speaker blasted pop music that echoed across my yard. Ms. Rogers turned back to her phone, as though dismissing me. Fury roiled inside me. I might have marched over and ordered everyone out then and there, if not for the kids. The last thing I wanted was to traumatize children who'd been told it was fine to swim, and Ms. Rogers clearly banked on that hesitance. She must have realized that sending families to enjoy the pool would make me look like the villain if I shut it down abruptly. Clever tactic. But she had no idea whom she was dealing with. A lawyer who specialized in land disputes, water rights, and property law. If she wanted to play this game, I had an entire legal arsenal ready. Biting my tongue, I nodded curtly at Ms. Rogers. "We'll discuss this soon," I muttered, heading into the house. She gave me that smug grin, one that said she'd thought she'd won. Let her think that, for now. The moment I got inside, I locked my door, drew the blinds, and called my longtime friend and legal partner, Sarah Middleton. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm. "Lucas, are you back in town already?" I let out a low hiss, pacing across my living room. "Yes, and you won't believe this. The HOA basically commandeered my private pool. 80 guests, Sarah, 80 guests on my property. Miss Rogers told them it's part of the extended community plan. I heard Sarah exhale in disbelief. That's a new level of brazen. So, you want me to come by with an eviction notice? She asked. I considered it. Not yet. If I forcibly evict them, Ms. Rogers will spin it as me being a heartless jerk. Let me gather some evidence first. You know how these HOA types can be with public sentiment. Sarah agreed wholeheartedly. We arranged to meet the next morning for a deeper discussion. Meanwhile, I set about documenting everything, snapping photos from my kitchen window, filming short videos of the crowd. I noticed Ms. Rogers walking around collecting event donations in a small metal box, so they were charging people for the privilege of using my water. Unbelievable. That sealed it. I had a rock-solid case for trespassing, unjust enrichment, and possibly theft of services if you consider my water usage as a service they were profiting from. As dusk settled, the party finally wound down. People trickled out, leaving behind crushed cups, empty snack bags, and a few random towels. I stepped outside to survey the damage. My once pristine pool deck was littered with footprints, soda spills, and confetti of some sort. Even worse, someone had scratched the tile near the diving board, presumably with some heavy object. My heart twinged. This pool wasn't just some amenity. I designed it in memory of my mother, who loved swimming. We used to talk about building a custom pool that harnessed the natural spring, giving it a unique filtration system, and now it was soiled by a mass of uninvited guests. Right as I finished picking up stray wrappers, Ms. Rogers reappeared with a bright flashlight. She greeted me in a syrupy voice. Wonderful turnout, don't you think? We raised nearly $500 for the HOA's beautification fund. She brandished the metal box. My temper flared. Beautification fund? Did you even ask for my consent? Or are you pocketing money from my pool? She put on a mask of innocence. We're a non-profit association, Mr. Kelly. Everything goes toward community improvements, which includes ensuring all shared amenities are well maintained. I clenched my jaw. This pool is not a shared amenity. This property is not part of Maplewood. You have no right to it. She gave a condescending sigh, stepping closer. Look, I realize you're upset, but you should have read the updated guidelines carefully. We integrated the water source behind your property into the broader plan for Maplewood's residents. We expect full compliance from all neighbors, including you. If you want to dispute it, feel free to file a complaint, but the board stands united. Her posture was stiff, challenging me to push back. I smiled thinly. I'll remember that, I said. Have a good night, Miss Rogers, and kindly tell any lingering guests to leave. She nodded, turning away. They're packing up, she said. We'll see you next time. Next time. The phrase rang in my head like a threat. She was basically promising more of these invasions. Inside, I poured myself a stiff drink, trying to steady my nerves. Ms. Rogers had unwittingly declared war. She might not realize I'm a top-tier litigator who's wrangled with corporations over water rights in other counties. My father's passing had left me not only this property, but also the original deed securing the rights to the natural spring. That means I could theoretically shut off or reroute the water. The entire area, including Maplewood, partly depends on that spring for stable water pressure. Ms. Rogers had no clue how big a misstep she'd just made. The next morning, Sarah arrived wearing her usual power suit, her brows furrowed at the sight of my messy pool area. What a disaster, she said, stepping around a half-empty soda can. I brought her inside, made some coffee, and laid out the details. She listened intently. We have them on trespassing, definitely. And if they've been collecting money, that's unjust enrichment off your property, she mused. But we also need to consider public perception. The HOA might spin it as you blocking a neighborhood resource. They've likely told everyone that the water belongs to Maplewood collectively. I nodded. True. But I have the actual water rights. My father secured them decades ago, and there's no official annexation of my property into Maplewood. She's bluffing or forging something. Sarah's eyes lit up. In that case, let's approach it from a property law angle first, then reveal your water rights if necessary. Keep that as the final trump card. I agreed. We decided on a multi-step plan. Demand a cease and desist letter to the HOA, forbidding any future events at my pool. Request a hearing with the county's property board to confirm the boundary lines. Investigate the HOA finances for evidence of misusing event donations. Once that was done, if Ms. Rogers still refused to yield, we'd bring up the water rights, possibly threatening to shut off or redirect the spring. That would devastate Maplewood, as their entire water system partially relied on that flow. We wanted to be strategic. Pulling the water supply too soon might paint me as a villain, but it was a potent weapon if Ms. Rogers forced our hand. I spent the day drafting the cease and desist letter with Sarah's input. I also compiled photos, videos, and statements from a few neighbors who quietly disapproved of Ms. Rogers' tactics. Some Maplewood residents were decent folks who felt uncomfortable about using someone else's pool, but feared speaking out. Ms. Rogers apparently ruled the HOA with an iron fist, issuing petty fines for minor lawn infractions, building alliances with local officials to shield herself from complaints. Everyone was too intimidated to confront her, until now. We mailed the letter that afternoon via certified mail, ensuring a record. Within 48 hours, Ms. Rogers was legally on notice to stop any future gatherings on my property, but I fully expected her to ignore it or to come up with a cunning workaround. Meanwhile, the Maplewood board scheduled an emergency meeting about my letter, to which I was pointedly not invited. Instead, I heard from a sympathetic neighbor that Miss Rogers planned to brand me as a troublemaker hindering community unity. She posted an update in the HOA newsletter, claiming I was threatening lawsuits over a harmless pool party. She conveniently left out the fact that she'd orchestrated an invasion of 80 guests and charged them money behind my back. The tension mounted daily. A few days after sending the cease and desist, I received a phone call from Ms. Rogers. She tried to sound polite, but I heard the edge in her tone. "Mr. Kelly," she said, "the HOA board requests a meeting with you to negotiate a more formal arrangement. We believe a mutual understanding about the pool is best for all." I suppressed a bitter laugh. "You want a meeting? In what capacity? Since the orchard fiasco or the new guidelines fiasco?" She brushed that aside. "We'd like to incorporate your pool into our official amenity roster. We're prepared to offer compensation if you sign an agreement." I nearly snorted. Compensation? She was basically trying to buy my compliance. "No, Ms. Rogers," I said. "My letter stands. No more events. We'll see you at the county hearing if needed." She clicked her tongue in annoyance. "You're being unreasonable. If we go down the legal route, it'll be messy for everyone." I let a beat pass, then calmly replied, "I'm a lawyer, Ms. Rogers. I excel at messy legal routes." With that, I ended the call. As expected, Ms. Rogers ramped up the pressure. Over the next week, I received 3 separate violation notices from the HOA for nonsense infractions. Unapproved fence color. My fence was built before Maplewood even existed. Overdue community improvement fee. I never agreed to join Maplewood, so no fees. Excessive water usage. The gall. She was referencing my own spring. I documented these notices as further evidence of her harassment. Meanwhile, rumors circulated that Miss Rogers wanted to forcibly annex my property, claiming it was historically part of the Maplewood subdivision. She even displayed an old map at an HOA meeting, though it was just a conceptual drawing, not an official record. People started gossiping that Miss Rogers might have bribed a local official to push for a boundary official. If so, I'd be ready to expose them. Finally, the day of the county hearing arrived, a property boundary dispute hearing that Sarah had helped me initiate. The hearing took place in a modest municipal building with a small board of 3 officials overseeing such matters. Ms. Rogers showed up flanked by 2 Maplewood board members, all wearing business suits. I stood with Sarah by my side holding a binder of legal documents, including my father's original land deed and the water rights contract. Miss Rogers looked at me with scorn, as if I were a nobody standing in her way. The hearing began with each side presenting their claim. Ms. Rogers's attorney argued that an old community development plan encompassed my lot, and that the pool was originally intended for Maplewood's use. The board members raised skeptical eyebrows. The attorney had no official records or stamps from the county. Sarah then presented my father's deed, along with county-stamped boundary lines that explicitly showed my property outside Maplewood's domain. We also introduced the cease and desist letter, the photos of the 80-person pool party, and the new guidelines Ms. Rogers tried to push. It was damning evidence. One board official cleared his throat. "Ms. Rogers, do you have any legitimate documentation that contradicts these official deeds?" She fumbled, pulling out the same worthless unofficial map. The official sighed. "This is not recognized by the county. Do you have anything else?" She shook her head, lips tight. By the hearing's end, it was obvious the board sided with me. They declared my property fully separate from Maplewood, invalidating Miss Rogers' claim of extended boundaries. The board also warned that hosting events on private land without permission could result in fines or even criminal charges. Miss Rogers tried to mask her fury as we left the building, but I caught the venom in her glare. You might think that solved the issue. But Ms. Rogers, cornered, decided to escalate. A few days later, a Maplewood publication circulated calling me a water hoarder who refused to share the spring with the community. She invoked environmental concerns, claiming I was blocking the natural flow that Maplewood needed. She threatened to petition the local government to force an easement for water usage. That's when I realized it was time to reveal the ultimate trump card, my father's carefully crafted water rights contract. That contract not only secured me exclusive usage, but gave me the legal authority to shut off or divert the spring if I deemed it necessary. Ms. Rogers had no clue how precarious Maplewood's water supply was in relation to that spring. I consulted with Sarah. She nodded grimly. "We've tried reasoning. The county hearing settled the boundary. Ms. Rogers is still pushing. We might have to play hardball. If you shut or reduce the spring flow, Maplewood's water pressure will drop, maybe even cause shortages. That would force them to negotiate or back off." I hesitated. My father taught me to use the water rights responsibly. Shutting the supply might affect innocent residents. But Ms. Rogers left me little choice. She was mobilizing the HOA to challenge me publicly. Maybe even forcibly tie into my lines. So, I decided on a measured approach. I'd send Ms. Rogers an ultimatum. Either she complied with the board's ruling acknowledging my property rights and ceasing all attempts to annex my pool, or I'd partially restrict the water flow to Maplewood. I wasn't proud of it, but it was the only way to protect what was mine. We drafted the letter carefully, making it clear that Maplewood would still receive enough water for essential needs, but not the full convenience they enjoyed. The letter explained that if Ms. Rogers kept harassing me with false claims, I'd reduce the flow further. I ended it with a line referencing my father's legacy. "This orchard and spring have been in my family for generations. I will protect them using every legal tool at my disposal." We delivered it by certified mail and email. Ms. Rogers responded within hours, calling me personally. Her voice was raw with anger. "How dare you threaten to cut off Maplewood's water? That's an act of sabotage." I replied calmly, "It's my water, Miss Rogers, as confirmed by the official deed. I'm simply deciding how much to share. If you keep pushing to claim my pool or property, you'll discover just how little goodwill I have left." She sputtered, threatening lawsuits, boycotts, media smear campaigns. I sighed, pointing out that the county hearing already dismantled her boundary arguments, and any further false claims might land her in legal trouble for slander. She ended the call with a furious, "You'll regret this." The next few days felt like the calm before a storm. I half expected Miss Rogers to stage another stunt. Instead, she pulled a lesser-known trick, approaching local reporters with a sob story about me monopolizing water and refusing community usage. One paper ran a small piece with the headline, "Resident Denies Neighbors Access to Beloved Pool." It was slanted, but not a full-blown attack. Some folks wrote letters to the editor defending me after reading about Miss Rogers' previous fiasco. The community was split, but Miss Rogers wouldn't let up. Then came the final straw. I caught Maplewood contractors creeping onto my property late one afternoon, digging near the main spring. They were apparently trying to install a secondary line or bypass, probably to secure direct access to the water. I spotted them from my living room window. Furious, I grabbed my phone to record as I confronted them. The workers stammered that Miss Rogers hired them to assess the water line. They retreated quickly when I threatened to call the sheriff. I had everything on camera, a blatant act of trespassing. Enough was enough. That very evening, I put my fallback plan into motion, partially shutting the water line that fed Maplewood. My father had installed a special valve years ago for emergencies, allowing us to control how much water was diverted. I turned the valve to reduce the flow by about half, enough for them to function, but they'd feel the pinch. By midday the next day, Maplewood residents discovered weaker water pressure in their taps, slower fill times in their pools. Miss Rogers, of course, panicked. She raced over to my property, banging on my gate. "Mr. Kelly, we need to talk." I let her stand there a minute, her frustration evident. Finally, I opened the gate and greeted her with a neutral expression. She'd brought a couple of HOA board members for backup. One older man cleared his throat. "Look, we realize there's been tension, but this is affecting hundreds of residents." Ms. Rogers stepped forward, voice shaky with rage. "Turn the water back on. This is unconscionable." I maintained my composure. "No one said you couldn't have water. You're still getting enough for basic needs. But as for the pool lounging convenience you enjoyed, that's off the table until Ms. Rogers acknowledges my property rights and stops interfering." She pointed a finger at me. "You're a monster. People rely on this supply." I gave her a mirthless smile. "I rely on my private pool and orchard not being invaded. The county recognized my property lines. Either you comply or the flow remains reduced." A tense silence followed. The older board member whispered to Ms. Rogers, urging calm. She took a shaky breath. "Fine. What do you want?" I spelled it out. "Immediate statement from the HOA acknowledging my property and pool do not belong to Maplewood. Formal apology to be published in their newsletter, admitting they overstepped. No more events or guests using my pool without explicit permission. Reimbursement for damages from the first event, including cleaning and tile repair." Miss Rogers's face twisted in humiliation, but the older board member nodded. "That's fair, given the circumstances." She shot him a glare, but her position was hopeless. The entire association was clamoring for restored water flow, and she had no legal leg to stand on. At last, Ms. Rogers exhaled, her anger replaced by reluctant acceptance. "We'll comply," she muttered, "but don't expect me to like it." I nodded. "I only expect you to keep your word." 2 days later, Maplewood residents opened their HOA newsletter to find an official statement. The Maplewood Board acknowledges that the property at 612 Oak Ridge Lane, including its pool, is fully owned by Mr. Lucas Kelly. Any past events there were held in error. We apologize for the inconvenience and commit to no further usage without permission. We will compensate Mr. Kelly for any damages. Ms. Rogers signed at the bottom. The board had also started a fundraiser among themselves to pay for my tile repairs and extra cleaning. That same day, Ms. Rogers emailed me a personal apology. Short, clipped, but meeting my demands. Satisfied, I reopened the valve to restore full water flow, and Maplewood's pressure returned to normal. Word spread quickly that the HOA's bid to claim my pool had backfired spectacularly. Residents whispered that Ms. Rogers had been outlawed and humiliated. Some demanded her resignation from the board. She clung to her position, but her influence waned. In the weeks that followed, I oversaw repairs to my pool, retiled the damaged area, and made sure the yard was pristine once again. The compensation from Maplewood covered a good chunk of costs. A few neighbors reached out, apologizing for Miss Rogers' stunts. One family admitted they felt pressured to attend the pool party, worried Miss Rogers might fine them for not participating. The grip she'd had on Maplewood was clearly rooted in fear and manipulation. As for me, I returned to my law practice, tackling major cases across the state. but local rumor mills lit up with the story of how Ms. Rogers tried to commandeer my pool and ended up nearly losing water for the entire neighborhood. Some described me as a feared lawyer who'd threatened to cut them off. Others saw me as a hero who taught the HOA a lesson. Honestly, I didn't care about the labels. I just wanted my property and father's legacy respected. Months later, life in Oak Hills mostly returned to normal. Ms. Rogers remained as HOA president but kept a low profile, avoiding direct conflict with me. She tried small jabs, like complaining about the color of my mailbox, but after I threatened to invoke the county's prior boundary ruling, she backed down. The Maplewood board replaced a few members with more cooperative folks who reached out to me with courtesy. Occasionally, they asked if I'd host a tiny neighborhood BBQ or let them use the yard for a fundraiser. Now that they approached me politely, I'd consider smaller events, but only on my terms, with strict conditions. I never forgot how Ms. Rogers exploited the kindness of families to trespass on my property. On quiet summer evenings, I lounged by my pool, gazing into the water fed by that gentle spring. My father would be proud to see how I defended our land. This pool might appear like a mere amenity to outsiders, but it's a symbol of my family's commitment to the land and the water. And to any future challengers, be they incompetent HOAs or shady developers, I remain ready to remind them, I'm the top lawyer around, I hold the water rights. And if you cross my boundary without respect, you'll find yourself swimming in a legal tidal wave you never saw coming.